Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. This is a podcast where I read old books, sometimes fiction, sometimes non-fiction, in the most boring way I can, to try help sow your spinning mind, enough for you to fall asleep in the most natural way possible. The stresses of life often follow us to bed and keep us company, but I'm here to distract you from them and help you drift away. But before you do drift away, if you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful and you would like to support me, to keep the show going out to you and thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider signing up on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. If monthly is a bit much, you can put a tip in the tip jar in the Ko-Fi. These options are both linked in the show notes. Or if you want to support the show without having to do so financially, you can just spread the word. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep, tell them where to find Sleepy Time Tales and leave it at that. And that's enough of that. We're going to be learning about the construction of Egyptian temples. So settle down, close your eyes, breathe deeply and listen closely as I lead you down the path to sleep. We return today to Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gina Maspero. At Luxor, the progress went on methodically under Amenhotep III and Seti I. But when Ramesses II desired to add to the work of his predecessors, a bend in the river compelled him to turn eastwards. His pylon is not parallel to that of Amenhotep III, and its colonnades make a distinct angle with the general axis of the earlier work. At Philae, the deviation is still greater. Not only is the larger pylon out of alignment with the smaller, but the two colonnades are not parallel with each other. Neither are they attached to the pylon with the due regard to symmetry. This arises neither from negligence nor willfulness, as is popularly supposed. The first plan was as regular as the most symmetrically minded designer could wish, but it became necessary to adapt it to the requirements of the site, and the architects were thenceforth chiefly concerned to make the best of the irregularities to which they were condemned by the configuration of the ground. Such difficulties were in fact a frequent source of inspiration, and Philae shows with what skill the Egyptians extracted every element of beauty and picturesqueness from enforced disorder. The idea of the rock-cut temple must have occurred to the Egyptians at an early period. They carved the houses of the dead in the mountainside. Why, therefore, should they not in like manner carve the houses of the gods? Yet the earliest known specious sanctuaries date from only the beginning of the 18th dynasty. They are generally found in those parts of the valley where the cultivable land is narrowest, as near Beni Hassan, at Gebel Silsileh, and in Nubia. All varieties of the constructed temple are found in the rock-cut temple, though more or less modified by local conditions. The Spios Artemidos is approached by a pillared portico, but contains only a square chamber with a niche at the end for the statue of the goddess Paket. At Kalat Ada, a flat narrow facade faces the river, and is flanked by a steep flight of steps. Next comes a hypostyle hall, flanked by two dark chambers, and lastly a sanctuary in 2 stories, one above the other. The chapel of Horemheb at Gebel Silsileh is formed of a galley parallel to the river, supported by 4 massive pillars left in the rock. From this gallery, the sanctuary chamber opens at right angles. At Abu Simbel, the 2 temples are excavated entirely in the cliff. The front of the great Spios imitates a sloping pylon crowned with a cornice, and guarded as usual by 4 seated colossi flanked by smaller statues. These colossi are 66 feet high. The doorway past there comes with a first hall measuring 130 feet in length by 60 feet in width, which corresponds to the ancient peristyle. 8 osiride statues backed by as many square pillars seem to bear the mountain on their heads. Beyond this come a hypostyle hall, a transverse gallery isolating the sanctuary and the sanctuary itself between its two smaller chambers. 8 crypts, sunk at a somewhat lower level than that of the main excavation, are unequally distributed to right and left of the peristyle. The whole excavation measures 180 feet from the doorway to the end of the sanctuary. The smallest busier of Hathor, about 100 paces to the northward, is of smaller dimensions. The facade is adorned with 6 standing colossi, 4 representing Ramesses II, and 2 his wife, Nefertari. The peristyle and the crypts are lacking, and the small chambers are placed at either end of the transverse passage, instead of being parallel with the sanctuary. The hypostyle hall, however, is supported by 6 Hathor-headed pillars. Where space permitted, the rock-cut temple was but partly excavated in the cliff, the forepart being constructed outside with blocks cut and dressed, and becoming half grotto, half building. In the hemispios at Dare, the peristyle is external to the cliff. At Beit al-Wali, the pylon and court are built. At Guf Hussein and Wadi Sabua, pylon, court, and hypostyle hall are all outside the mountain. The most celebrated and original hemispios is that built by Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari in the Theban necropolis. The sanctuary and chapels, which, as usual, accompany it, were cut about 100 feet above the level of the valley. In order to arrive at that height, slopes were made and terraces laid out according to a plan which was not understood until the site was thoroughly excavated. Between the hemispios and the isolated temple, the Egyptians created yet another variety, namely the built temple, backed by but not carried into the cliff. The temple of the Sphinx at Gizeh and the temple of Seti at Abydos may be cited as 2 good examples. I have already described the former. The area of the latter was cleared in a narrow and shallow belt of sand, which here divides the plain from the desert. It was sunk up to the roof, the tops of the walls but just showing above the level of the ground. The staircase which led up to the terraced roof led also to the top of the hill. The front, which stood completely out, seemed in no wise extraordinary. It was approached by 2 pylons, 2 courts, and a shallow portico, supported on square pillars. The unusual part of the building only began beyond this point. First, there were 2 hypostyle halls instead of 1. These are separated by a wall with 7 doorways. There is no nave, and the sanctuary opens direct from the second hall. This, as usual, consists of an oblong chamber with a door at each end. But the rooms by which it is usually surrounded are here placed side by side in a line, 2 to the right and 4 to the left. Further, they are covered by corbelled vaults, and are lighted only from the doors. Behind the sanctuaries are further novelties. Another hypostyle hall abuts on the end wall, and its dependencies are unequally distributed to right and left. As if this were not enough, the architect also constructed, to the left of the main building, a court, 5 chambers of columns, various passages and dark chambers. In short, an entire wing branching off at right angles to the axis of the temple proper, with no counterbalancing structures on the other side. These irregularities become intelligible when the site is examined. The cliff is shallow at this part, and the smaller hypostyle hall is backed by only a thin partition of rock. If the usual plan had been followed, it would have been necessary to cut the cliff entirely away, and the structure would have forfeited its special characteristic, that of a temple backed by a cliff, as desired by the founder. The architect therefore distributed in width those portions of the edifice which he could not carry out in length, and he even threw out a wing. Some years later, when Ramesses II constructed a monument to his own memory, about 100 yards to the northward of the older building, he was careful not to follow in his father's footsteps. Built on top of an elevation, his temple had sufficient space for development, and the conventional plan was followed in all its strictness. Most temples, even the smallest, should be surrounded by a square enclosure or temenos. At Medinet Habu, the enclosure wall is of sandstone, low and embattled. The innovation is due to a whim of Ramses III, who, in giving to his monument the outward appearance of a fortress, sought to commemorate his Syrian victories. Elsewhere the doorways are of stone, and the walls are built in irregular courses of crude bricks. The great enclosure wall was not, as frequently stated, intended to isolate the temple and screen the priestly ceremonies from eyes profane. It marked the limits of the divine dwelling, and served, when needful, to resist the attacks of enemies whose cupidity might be excited by the accumulated riches of the sanctuary. As at Karnak, avenues of sphinxes and series of pylons led up to the various gates, and formed triumphal approaches. The rest of the ground was in part occupied by stables, cellarage, granaries, and private houses. Just as in Europe during the Middle Ages, the population crowded most densely around the churches and abbeys, so in Egypt they swarmed around the temples, profiting by that security which the terror of his name and the solidity of his ramparts ensured to the local deity. A clear space was at first reserved around the pylons and the walls, but in course of time the houses encroached upon this ground, and were even built up against the boundary wall. Destroyed and rebuilt century after century upon the self-same spot, the debris of these surrounding dwellings so raised the level of the soil that the temple ended for the most part by being gradually buried in a hollow formed by the artificial elevation of the surrounding city. Herodotus noticed this at Bubastis, and on examination it is seen to have been the same in many other localities. At Ombos, at Edfu, at Dendera, the whole city nestled inside the precincts of the divine dwelling. At Al-Kab, where the temple Temenos formed a separate enclosure within the boundary of the city walls, it served as a sort of donjon or keep, in which the garrison could seek a last refuge. At Memphis and at Thebes there were as many keeps as there were great temples, and these sacred fortresses, each at first standing alone in the midst of houses, were, from the time of the 18th dynasty, connected with each other by avenues of sphinxes. These were commonly androsphinxes, combining the head of a man and the body of a lion, but we also find cryosphinxes, which united a ram's head with a lion's body. Elsewhere, in places where the local worship admitted of such substitution, a couchant ram, holding a statuette of the royal founder between his bent forelegs, takes the place of the conventional sphinx. The avenue leading from Luxor to Karnak was composed of these diverse elements. It was 1 mile and a quarter in length, and there were many bends in it. But this fact affords no fresh proof of Egyptian symmetrophobia. The enclosures of the two temples were not oriented alike, and the avenues which started squarely from the fronts of each could never have met had they not deviated from their first course. Finally, it may be said that the inhabitants of Thebes saw about as much of their temples as we see at the present day. The sanctuary and its immediate surroundings were closed against them, but they had access to the facades, the courts, and even the hypostyle halls, and might admire the masterpieces of their architects as freely as we admire them now. Decoration. Ancient tradition affirmed that the earliest Egyptian temples contained neither sculptured images, inscriptions, nor symbols, and in point of fact, the temple of the Sphinx is bare. But this is a unique example. The fragments of architraves and masonry bearing the name of Khafra, which are used for building material in the northern pyramid of Lisht, show that this primitive simplicity had already been abandoned by the time of the 4th dynasty. During the Theban period, all smooth surfaces, all pylons, wall faces, and shafts of columns were covered with figure groups and inscriptions. Under the Ptolemies and the Caesars, figures and hieroglyphs became so crowded on the stone on which they are sculpted, seems to be lost under the masses of ornament with which it is charged. We recognize at a glance that these scenes are not placed at random. They follow in sequence, are interlinked, and form, as it were, a great mystic book in which the official relations between gods and men, as well as between men and gods, are clearly set forth, for such as are skilled to read them. The temple was built in the likeness of the world, as the world was known to the Egyptians. The earth, as they believed, was a flat and shallow plain, longer than its width. The sky, according to some, extended overhead like an immense iron ceiling, and according to others like a huge shallow vault. As it could not remain suspended in space without some support, they imagined it to be held in place by four immense props or pillars. The floor of the temple naturally represented the earth. The columns, and if needful, the four corners of the chambers, stood for the pillars. The roof, vaulted at Abydos, flat elsewhere, corresponded exactly with the Egyptian idea of the sky. Each of these parts was therefore decorated in consonance with its meaning. Those next to the ground were clothed with vegetation. The bases of the columns were surrounded by leaves, and the lower parts of the walls were adorned with long stems of lotus or papyrus, in the midst of which animals were occasionally depicted. Bouquets of water plants emerging from the water enlivened the bottom of the wall space in certain chambers. Elsewhere we find full-blown flowers interspersed with buds, or tied together with cords, or those emblematic plants which symbolized the union of Upper and Lower Egypt under the rule of a single pharaoh, or birds with human hands and arms perched in an attitude of adoration on the sign which represents a solemn festival, or kneeling prisoners tied to the stake in couples, each couple consisting of an Asiatic and a Negro. Male and female Niles laden with flowers and fruits either kneel or advance in majestic procession along the ground level. These are the nomes, lakes, and districts of Egypt, bringing offerings of their products to the god. In one instance, at Karnak, Thutmose III caused the fruits, flowers, and animals indigenous to the foreign lands which he had conquered to be sculptured on the lower courses of his walls. The ceilings were painted blue and sprinkled with 5 pointed stars painted yellow, occasionally interspersed with the cartouches of the royal founder. The monotony of this Egyptian heaven was also relieved by long bands of hieroglyphic inscriptions. The vultures of Nekeb and Uati, the goddesses of the south and north, crowned and armed with divine emblems, hovered above the nave of the hypostyle halls, and on the underside of the lintels of the great doors above the head of the king as he passed through on his way to the sanctuary. At the Ramesseum, at Edfu, at Philae, at Dendera, at Ombos, at Esna, the depths of the firmament seemed to open to the eyes of the faithful, revealing the dwellers therein. There the celestial ocean poured forth its floods, navigated by the sun and moon, with their attendant escort of planets, constellations, and decani, and there also the genii of the months and days marched in long procession. In the Ptolemaic age, zodiacs fashioned after Greek models were sculptured side by side with astronomical tables of purely native origin. The decoration of the architraves which supported the massive roofing slabs was entirely independent of that of the ceiling itself. On those were wrought nothing save boldly cut inscriptions, in which the beauty of the temple, the names of the builder kings who had erected it, and the glory of the gods to whom it was consecrated are emphatically celebrated. Finally, the decoration of the lowest part of the walls and of the ceiling was restricted to a small number of subjects, which were always similar, and most important and varied scenes being suspended, as it were, between earth and heaven, on the sides of the chambers and the pylons. These scenes illustrate the official relations which subsisted between Egypt and the gods. The people had no rights of direct intercourse with the deities. They needed a mediator, who, partaking of both human and divine nature, was qualified to communicate with both. The king alone, son of the sun, was of sufficiently high descent to contemplate the god in his temple, to serve him and to speak with him face to face. Sacrifices could be offered only by him or through him and in his name. Even the customary offerings to the dead were supposed to pass through his hands, and a family availed themselves of his name in the formula Sultan Tahotep to forward them to the other world. The king is seen, therefore, in all parts of the temple, standing, seated, kneeling, slaying the victim, presenting the parts, pouring out the wine, the milk, and the oil, and burning the incense. All humankind acts through him, and through him performs its duty towards the gods. When the ceremonies to be performed required the assistance of many persons, then alone did mortal subordinates, consisting as much as possible of his own family, appear by his side. The queen, standing behind him like Isis behind Osiris, uplifts her hand to protect him, shakes the sistrum, beats the tambourine to dispel evil spirits, or holds the libation vase or bouquet. The eldest son carries the net or lassos the bull, and recites the prayer while his father successively presents to the god each object prescribed by the ritual. A priest may occasionally act as a substitute for the prince, but other men perform only the most menial offices. They are slaughterers or servants, or they bear the boat or canopy of the god. The god, for his part, is not always alone. He has his wife and his son by his side. Next after them, the gods of the neighboring homes, and in a general way, all the gods of Egypt. From the moment that the temple is regarded as representing the world, it must, like the world, contain all gods, both great and small. They are most frequently ranged behind the principal god, seated or standing, and with him they share in the homage paid by the king. Sometimes, however, they take an active part in the ceremonies. The spirits of On and Konu kneel before the sun and proclaim his praise. Hor, Set or Thoth conduct Pharaoh into the presence of his father Amun-Ra, or perform the functions elsewhere assigned to the prince or the priest. They help him to overthrow the victim or to snare birds for the sacrifice, and in order to wash away his impurities, they pour upon his head the waters of youth and life. The position and functions of these cooperating gods were strictly defined in the theology. The sun, traveling from east to west, divided the universe into two worlds, the world of the north and the world of the south. The temple, like the universe, was double, and an imaginary line passing through the axis of the sanctuary divided it into two temples, the temple of the south on the right hand, and the temple of the north on the left. The gods and their various manifestations were divided between these two temples, according as they belonged to the northern or southern hemisphere. This fiction of duality was carried yet further. Each chamber was divided, in imitation of the temple, into two halves, the right half belonging to the south and the left half to the north. The royal homage, to be complete, must be rendered in the temples of the south and of the north, and to the gods of the south and of the north, and with the products of the south and the north. Each sculptured tableau must therefore be repeated at least twice in each temple, on a right wall and on a left wall. Amun on the right receives the corn, the wine, the liquids of the south, while on the left he receives the corn, the wine, and the liquids of the north. As with Amun, so with Maut, Khonsu, Mentu, and many other gods. Want of space frequently frustrated the due execution of this scheme, and we often meet with a tableau in which the products of north and south together are placed before an Amun, who represents both Amun of the south and Amun of the north. These departures from decorative usage are, however, exceptional, and the dual symmetry is always observed where space permits. In pharaonic times, the tableaux were not overcrowded. The wall surface intended to be covered was marked off below by a line carried just above the ground level decoration, and was bounded above by the usual cornice or by a frieze. This frieze might be composed of urae or of bunches of lotus, or of royal cartouches, supported on either side by divine symbols, or of emblems borrowed from the local cult, by heads of Hathor, for instance, in a temple dedicated to Hathor, or of a horizontal line of dedicatory inscription engraved in large and deeply cut hieroglyphs. The wall space thus framed in contains sometimes a single scene and sometimes two scenes, one above the other. The wall must be very lofty if this number is exceeded. Figures and inscriptions were widely spaced, and the scenes succeeded one another with scarcely a break. The spectator had to discover for himself where they began or ended. The head of the king was always studied from the life, and the faces of the gods reproduced the royal portrait as closely as possible. As Pharaoh was the son of the gods, the surest way to obtain portraits of the gods was to model their faces after the face of the king. The secondary figures were no less carefully wrought, but when these were very numerous, they were arranged on 2 or 3 levels, the total height of which never exceeded that of the principal personages. The offerings, the scepters, the jewels, the vestments, the headdresses, and all the accessories were treated with a genuine feeling for elegance and truth. The colors, moreover, were so combined as to produce in each tableau the effect of one general and prevailing tone, so that in many temples there were chambers which can be justly distinguished as the blue hall, the red hall, or the golden hall. So much for the classical period of decoration. As we come down to later times, these tableaux are multiplied, and under the Greeks and Romans they become so numerous that the smallest wall contained no less than 4, 5, 6, or even 8 registers. The principal figures are, as it were, compressed, so as to occupy less room, and all the intermediate space is crowded with thousands of tiny hieroglyphs. The gods and kings are no longer portraits of the reigning sovereign, but mere conventional types without vigor or life. As for secondary figures and accessories, the sculptor's only care is to crowd in as many as possible. This was not due to a defect of taste, and to the prevalence of a religious idea which decided but enforced these changes. The object of decoration was not merely the delight of the eye. Applied to a piece of furniture, a coffin, a house, a temple, a decoration possessed a certain magic property of which the power and nature were determined by each being or action, represented by each word, inscribed or spoken, at the moment of consecration. Every subject was therefore an amulet as well as an ornament, so long as it endured and ensured to the god the continuance of homage rendered, or sacrifices offered, by the king. To the king, whether living or dead, it confirmed the favors granted to him by the gods in recompense for his piety. It also preserved from destruction the very wall upon which it was depicted. At the time of the 18th dynasty, it was thought that 2 or 3 such amulets sufficed to compass the desired effect, but at a later period it was believed that their numbers could not be too freely multiplied, and the walls were covered with as many as the surface would contain. An average chamber of Edfu or Dendera yields more material for study than the hypostyle hall of Karnak, and the chapel of Antonius Pius at Pile, had it been finished, would have contained more scenes than the sanctuary of Luxor and the passages by which it is surrounded. Observing the variety of subjects treated on the walls of any one temple, one might at first be tempted to think that the decoration does not form a connected whole, and that although many series of scenes most undoubtedly contain the development of a historic idea or a religious dogma, yet that others are merely strung together without any necessary link. At Luxor, and again at the Ramesseum, each face of the pylon is a battlefield on which may be studied, almost day for day, the campaign of Ramesses II against the Kheta, which took place in the 5th year of his reign. There we see the Egyptian camp attacked by night, the king's bodyguard surprised during the march, the defeat of the enemy, their flight, the garrison of Kadesh sallying forth to the relief of the vanquished, and the disasters which befell the prince of the Ketar and his generals. Elsewhere it is not the war which is represented, but the human sacrifices which anciently celebrated the close of each campaign. The king is seen in the act of seizing his prostrate prisoners by the hairs of their heads and uplifting his mace, as if to shatter their heads at a single blow. At Karnak, along the whole length of the outer wall, Seti I pursues the Bedouin of Sinai. At Medinet Habu, Ramses III destroys the fleet of the peoples of the Great Sea, receives the cut-off hands of the Libyans, which his soldiers bring to him as trophies. In the next scene all is peace, and we behold Pharaoh pouring out a libation of perfumed water to his father Amen. It would seem as if no link could be established between these subjects, but yet the one is the necessary consequence of the others. If the god had not granted victory to the king in his turn would not have performed these ceremonies in the temple. The sculptor has recorded the events in their order, first the victory, then the sacrifice. The favor of the god precedes the thank offering of the king. Thus, on closer examination, we find this multitude of episodes forming the several links of one continuous chain, while every scene, including such as seem at first sight to be wholly unexplained, represents one stage in the development of a single action, which begins at the door, is carried through the various halls, and penetrates to the farthest recesses of the sanctuary. The king enters the temple. In the courts he is everywhere confronted by reminiscences of his victories, and here the god comes forth to greet him, hidden in a shrine and surrounded by priests. The rites prescribed for these occasions are graven on the walls of the hypostyle hall in which they were performed. These being over, king and god together take their way to the sanctuary. At the door which leads from the public hall to the mysterious part of the temple, the escort halts. The king crosses the threshold alone and is welcomed by the gods. He then performs in due order all the sacred ceremonies enjoined by usage. His merits increase by virtue of his prayers. His senses become exalted. He rises to the level of the divine type. Finally, he enters the sanctuary where the god reveals himself unwitnessed and speaks to him face to face. The sculptures faithfully reproduce the order of this mystic presentation. The welcoming reception on the part of the god, the acts and offerings of the king, the vestments which he puts on and off in succession, the various crowns on which he places on his head, the prayers which he recites and the favors which are conferred upon him are also recorded upon the walls, in order of time and place. The king and the few who accompany him have their backs towards the entrance, and their faces towards the door of the sanctuary. The gods, on the contrary, or at least such as do not make part of the procession, face the entrance, and have their backs turned towards the sanctuary. If, during the ceremony, the royal memory failed, the king needed but to raise his eyes to the wall, whereon his duties were mapped out for him. Nor was this all. Each part of the temple had its accessory decoration and its furniture. The outer faces of the pylons were ornamented, not only with the masts and streamers before mentioned, but with statues and obelisks. The statues, 4 or 6 in number, were of limestone, granite, or sandstone. They invariably represented the royal founder, and were sometimes of prodigious size. The 2 Memnon seated at the entrance of the temple of Amenhotep at Thebes mentioned about 50 feet in height. The colossal Ramesses II of the Ramesseum measured 57 feet, and that of Tanis at least 70 feet. The greater number, however, did not exceed 20 feet. They mounted guard before the temple, facing outwards as if confronting an approaching enemy. The obelisks of Karnak are mostly hidden amid the central courts, and those of Queen Hatshepsut were embedded for 17 feet of their height in masses of masonry which concealed their bases. These are accidental circumstances, and easy of explanation. Each of the pylons before which they are stationed had in its turn been the entrance to the temple, and was thrown into the rear by the works of succeeding pharaohs. The true place of all obelisks was in front of the colossi, on each side of the main entrance. They are always in pairs, but often of unequal height. Some have professed to see in them the emblem of Amen, the generator, or a finger of the god, or a ray of the sun. In sober truth, they are a more shapely form of the standing stone or menhir, which is raised by semi-civilized peoples in commemoration of their gods or their dead. Small obelisks about 3 feet in height are found in tombs as early as the 4th dynasty. They are placed to right and left of the stele, that is to say, on either side of the door which leads to the dwelling of the dead. Erected before the pylon gates of temples, they are made of granite, and their dimensions are considerable. The obelisk of Heliopolis measures 68 feet in the shaft, and the obelisks of Luxor stand 77 and 75.5 feet high, respectively. The loftiest known is the obelisk of Queen Hatshepsut at Karnak, which rises to a height of 109 feet. To convey such masses and to place them in equilibrium was a sufficiently difficult task, and one is at a loss to understand how the Egyptians succeeded in erecting them with no other appliances than ropes and sacks of sand. Queen Hatshepsut boasts that her obelisks were quarried, shaped, transported, and erected in 7 months, and we have no reason to doubt the truth of her statement. And on that wild claim, we are going to call it a night. As always, if you'd like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.